The night was quiet, yet the city never truly slept. Street lights cast a yellow glow on the damp pavement, reflecting the soft drizzle that had begun to fall. The high-end district of downtown buzzed with the remnants of an elegant evening. A charity gala had just concluded at the Regent Hotel, and the last of the guests were making their way home. Stepping into sleek black cars with uniformed drivers holding umbrellas over their heads. Among them was Olivia Carter, a striking woman in her early 40s, wearing a midnight blue gown that shimmered subtly under the streetlights. She carried herself with the kind of poised confidence that only came from years of navigating the brutal world of politics. Olivia was a United States Senator, a woman of principle who had fought for justice and equality her entire career. But at that moment, she was just a woman leaving a long evening. Exhausted, ready to return home, she stepped toward her limousine, parked just outside the hotel, where her driver, Marcus, waited beside the open door. As she moved forward, a police cruiser rolled to a slow stop at the curb. Officer Daniel Briggs sat in the driver's seat, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel as he observed the scene. Something about the woman stepping into the limousine set off an instinct in him, an instinct honed not by experience, but by bias. A black woman, alone at this hour, dressed in an expensive gown, stepping into an extravagant car. It didn't fit into the neat categories he had in his mind. Daniel wasn't a bad cop. Or at least, that's what he told himself. He believed in law and order, in keeping the streets safe. But what he never admitted was that he also believed in his own prejudices. He switched on the siren, just one sharp burst. Olivia, startled, turned her head. Marcus frowned but didn't move, waiting for her instruction. Daniel stepped out of the cruiser, his boots making a sharp sound against the wet pavement. "Ma'am, hold on a second," he said, approaching Olivia with one hand resting on his holster. "I need to ask you a few questions." Olivia arched a brow, her expression remaining neutral. She had encountered men like him before, too many times to count. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice even, careful. Daniel's eyes flicked over her, then to Marcus, then to the limousine. "You heading somewhere?" he asked. Olivia let out a soft breath. "Yes, home. I attended a charity event here at the Regent." Daniel smirked slightly, shifting his stance. "A charity event, huh? You got ID?" Marcus took a step forward. "Officer, this is Senator. I wasn't talking to you." Daniel snapped, his gaze turning sharp. "Step back." Olivia placed a hand on Marcus's arm, signaling him to stay calm. "I do have ID," she said, reaching for her clutch. "May I retrieve it?" Daniel hesitated. Something in him wanted to say no, wanted to push further, to see if she would react in a way that would justify his instincts. But he nodded. As Olivia opened her clutch and pulled out her ID, Daniel's eyes lingered on her fingers. Manicured, elegant, no trace of nervousness. That irritated him. He took the ID and studied it, his smirk fading as his eyes scanned the name. Olivia Carter, U.S. Senator. His stomach twisted slightly, but he forced his expression to remain impassive. Still, he wasn't ready to back down. "Got any proof you actually belong in that car?" he asked. Nodding toward the limousine, Olivia's patience began to thin. "That is my driver, Marcus. This is my car. I believe my identification is more than sufficient." Daniel tilted his head, just being thorough. "Ma'am, you know, lots of folks pretend to be someone they're not." She held his gaze. "Yes, I'm aware, and I also know when I'm being profiled." A flicker of something passed through Daniel's eyes, frustration, irritation, or perhaps a tiny sliver of shame. But it was fleeting. "You can go," he said, tossing her ID back at her carelessly. Olivia caught it without flinching, but Marcus's jaw clenched. As she stepped into the car, she knew, this wasn't over. Daniel could have left it at that. He should have, but something in him still burned. Maybe it was the way she had looked at him, unafraid, unbothered. Or maybe it was the way Marcus had tensed as if he wanted to say something but held back. He hated that, so he stepped closer to the limousine door just as Olivia was about to shut it. "Actually, ma'am, step out of the vehicle." Marcus's head snapped toward him. "Are you serious?" Daniel ignored him. "I said step out of the car." Olivia's patience finally gave way. She met his gaze, steel in her voice. "Officer, unless you are formally detaining me, I have no obligation to comply with." He reached for the door handle. "I am detaining you. Suspicious activity." Marcus immediately moved, but Daniel's hand went to his holster. "Stay where you are," he warned. Olivia let out a slow breath. Then, deliberately, without rush, stepped out of the limousine. Around them, a few late-night pedestrians had begun to slow their pace, eyes drawn toward the scene. A man in a hoodie pulled out his phone, recording. Daniel's heart pounded, but his ego didn't let him back down. "Turn around. Hands on the car," he ordered. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the small crowd. Olivia, still poised, did not move. "This is an abuse of power," she stated firmly. Daniel scoffed. "That's so? Then maybe you should have followed directions the first time." Without warning, he grabbed her arm and twisted it behind her back. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. "Hey, what the hell, man?" someone shouted. Olivia stumbled forward, her hands forced against the cold metal of the limousine. The rough grip on her arm sent a jolt of pain up her shoulder. But she clenched her jaw, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Daniel pulled out his cuffs, snapping them onto her wrists. "You're under investigation for suspicious activity," he said, his voice loud, meant for the growing audience. "You have the right to remain silent." Olivia exhaled slowly, fury simmering beneath her calm exterior. This wasn't just an act of humiliation. This was a declaration of war. It began as a small clip, a shaky phone recording, uploaded to Twitter by a random passerby. A black woman in an evening gown, being handcuffed against a luxury car. The cops gripped tight, the woman's posture unbowed. No context, no names, just an image. And in minutes, it went viral. The air in the city was thick with tension. It had only been a few hours since the video surfaced, but the storm had already begun to rage. Social media exploded with outrage, the footage spreading like wildfire across every platform. Another case of racial profiling. A black woman in an evening gown handcuffed like a criminal. Who is she? Why was she treated this way? The initial shock turned to fury as more details emerged. By morning, the world knew exactly who the woman in the video was. Senator Olivia Carter. The revelation sent shockwaves through the media. News outlets scrambled to report on the incident. Political commentators speculated on the fallout. Protests were already being planned. The mayor's office issued a cautious statement about reviewing the matter, while the police department released a generic response, promising to investigate fully. But the public didn't need an investigation. They had seen the truth with their own eyes. Daniel Briggs sat stiffly in the precinct's break room, staring at his coffee as if the liquid held the answers to his growing anxiety. His phone had been blowing up all morning, calls from reporters, messages from people he hadn't spoken to in years. Even his own colleagues were whispering when he walked past. He hadn't expected this. Sure, he knew the situation had been caught on camera. These days, everything was, but he thought it would be another small story. A quick controversy that would be forgotten in a news cycle or two. He had done his job, hadn't he? He had followed his gut. Now, it seemed that very instinct was about to ruin his life. The station chief, a burly man with graying hair, stormed into the room, his expression like thunder. "Briggs, in my office." Now. Daniel swallowed hard and followed. Inside, the chief shut the door and immediately threw a tablet onto the desk in front of Daniel. The screen played the video, again, looping the moment Daniel had grabbed Olivia Carter's arm, twisted it behind her back, and forced her against the limousine. "You want to tell me what the hell you were thinking?" the chief demanded. His voice dangerously low. Daniel squared his shoulders. "She was acting suspicious. I had a reason to detain." "She's a goddamn U.S. senator," the chief roared, slamming his fist on the desk. "And you didn't just detain her. You humiliated her. You put hands on a sitting senator in front of a crowd. And now? Now you've single-handedly turned the entire goddamn department into a national disgrace." Daniel's face reddened. "I didn't know who she was at the time." "That's not an excuse," the chief snapped. "You shouldn't be treating anyone like that, senator or not. And now I've got the mayor breathing down my neck, the commissioner demanding your head, and protesters ready to set the damn city on fire because of you." Daniel felt the first stirrings of real fear. "Am I being fired?" The chief exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his forehead. "I should, but for now, you're on administrative leave pending an internal investigation." Daniel's gut twisted. Leave? Chief. You can't. I can. And I will. His boss's eyes narrowed. Get out of my office. Briggs. And for your own sake. Stay out of the public eye. Across town, Olivia sat at the marble counter of her modern kitchen, her phone ringing non-stop. Her chief of staff, Rachel Moreno, was pacing back and forth, her voice a sharp contrast to the calm Olivia maintained. This is a nightmare. The police department is scrambling. The mayor is offering a meeting. And every goddamn news station in the country wants an exclusive. Olivia, we have to act. Olivia took a slow sip of her tea. We will. Rachel stopped pacing. When? How? If we wait too long, they'll spin the narrative against you. They're already calling it a misunderstanding. The police are going to cover for him. And the system will bury this. Olivia set her cup down with deliberate care. Not this time. Rachel exhaled, running a hand through her hair. Then what's the plan? Olivia's gaze was steely, unwavering. We fight back. She picked up her phone and dialed a number. Get me a press conference. The conference room was packed. Reporters elbowing each other for a front row view. Camera flashes flickered like lightning as Olivia took her place at the podium. She wore a deep navy blue suit, powerful, commanding. Her eyes scanned the room, her posture exuding grace and defiance. She did not start with anger. She started with the truth. Last night, I was detained, humiliated, and treated as a criminal, for no reason other than the color of my skin and the bias of one officer. The room fell silent. I was handcuffed. I was forced against my own car. And if I had not been a senator, if my name had not carried weight, I know I would have been another statistic. Another black woman treated as less than human. She paused, letting the words settle. But I am not just speaking for myself. I am speaking for every person who has no title, no platform, no protection, for those who face this same injustice every single day, but are never heard. A murmur rippled through the crowd. This is not just about one officer. Olivia continued. It is about a system that has allowed racial bias to fester. A system that protects bad cops over innocent citizens. A system that sees blackness as a threat. She leaned forward, her voice clear, commanding. And let me be absolutely clear, I will not let this go unanswered. Reporters began shouting questions, but Olivia had already said what needed to be said. She turned and walked off stage, ready for battle. The fallout was immediate. Protests erupted in multiple cities. Activists flooded the streets, holding signs with Olivia's words in bold letters. The color of my skin is not a crime. Justice for all, not just the powerful. End racial profiling now. News anchors debated the case on every channel. Political figures either rushed to Olivia's defense or scrambled to distance themselves. And Daniel Briggs? He watched it all unfold from his darkened living room, his phone ringing endlessly with calls he couldn't bear to answer. His life was unraveling, and for the first time, he began to understand. He had no idea what he had just started. The morning air was crisp, but the weight of the previous night still lingered over the city like an unshakable fog. Olivia Carter sat in the backseat of her limousine, her eyes fixed on the blur of buildings passing by. She had barely slept. The press conference had been only the beginning, a declaration of war, but now came the real battle. Her phone vibrated on the seat beside her. Rachel Moreno's name flashed across the screen. She answered. What's the latest? Rachel's voice was sharp, efficient. The governor's office reached out. He wants to meet privately to discuss the situation. Translation? He's trying to see how much of a problem you're going to be for him. Olivia smirked. He should already know the answer to that. Rachel continued. The Department of Justice is also under pressure to launch an independent investigation into the police department. If that happens, Briggs is in deeper trouble than just being suspended. Olivia leaned back, tapping a manicured finger against the armrest. What about the mayor? He's playing both sides. Publicly, he's deeply concerned. Privately, he's probably on the phone with the police union figuring out how to contain this. Olivia exhaled slowly. They always protect their own. Rachel's voice hardened. And that's why we have to push harder. The protests are growing. Civil rights organizations are reaching out. You have a platform that most victims never do. Olivia, if we don't use it, I intend to use it. Olivia interrupted, her voice steady. Briggs humiliated me, but I won't make this about myself. I'll make this about every single person who's suffered under a system that lets men like him operate with impunity. Rachel was silent for a beat. Then, quietly, she said, "I'll set up interviews. Every major network wants you." Olivia nodded, though Rachel couldn't see it. "Good. Let's make sure this doesn't die down. We keep the pressure on." She ended the call just as the limousine slowed in front of the Senate building. Today, she had work to do. The precinct felt different. The usual camaraderie was gone, replaced by something colder. Tension hummed in the air like static before a storm. Daniel Briggs walked into the locker room, ignoring the looks from his fellow officers. Some barely glanced at him. Others muttered under their breath. He caught a few words. Suspended. Idiot. Ruined us all. He clenched his jaw and threw his bag into his locker. He had expected this, but it didn't make it any easier. He was being treated like a criminal. Just because some senator got her feelings hurt? Briggs. He turned. Detective Raymond Hall, a senior officer with graying temples, stood at the doorway, arms crossed. "The chief wants to see you." "Now." Daniel didn't reply, just shut his locker and followed. When he entered the chief's office, the air was suffocating. Captain Linda Powell, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper reputation, sat next to the chief. A file lay open on the desk between them. "Briggs," the chief said, rubbing his temples, "this just got worse." Daniel's stomach tightened. "Worse?" Captain Powell slid the file toward him. "The Department of Justice is launching an inquiry into the department. Your case is at the center of it." Daniel's hands curled into fists. "You can't be serious." The chief sighed. "Oh, I'm serious. We're talking federal investigators. Briggs, this isn't just about Olivia Carter anymore. They're digging into everything. Complaints, excessive force reports, patterns of misconduct." Daniel felt his pulse spike. "I've done my job. That's all I've ever done." Captain Powell's gaze didn't waver. "Have you?" Daniel stiffened. "You're really throwing me under the bus?" The chief gave a humorless laugh. "This isn't about you anymore, Briggs. This is about the entire department. The DOJ will find whatever dirt they can. And you just made sure they'll be looking at us under a microscope." Daniel's skin felt hot. His career, his life, was spiraling, and he couldn't stop it. "Get yourself a lawyer," Captain Powell said. "You're going to need one." Lisa Briggs sat at the dining room table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The news played on the TV across the room, the volume low, but the words still cut through the silence like a blade. Senator Olivia Carter speaks out following her wrongful detainment by Officer Daniel Briggs. Lisa stared at the screen, at the image of her husband's face flashing next to the senator's. She barely recognized him anymore. The front door opened, and Daniel walked in, his expression hard. He threw his keys on the counter and poured himself a drink. Lisa watched him, her stomach twisting. "You need to fix this," she said softly. Daniel scoffed. "Fix what?" Lisa turned to face him fully. "This is getting bigger. Dan, people are protesting. The DOJ is involved. And you." She swallowed. "You look like the villain." Daniel's grip tightened around his glass. "I did my job, Lisa." She let out a hollow laugh. "Did you? Or did you let your bias decide who was guilty?" He turned sharply. "You think I'm a racist?" "I think," Lisa said carefully, "that you let your prejudices control you. And now the whole country sees it." Daniel exhaled heavily, rubbing his face. "I didn't know who she was." "That's not the point," Lisa whispered. "You shouldn't treat anyone like that." For the first time since this all started, Daniel had nothing to say. Lisa stood. "I need some time. I'm taking the kids to my sister's for a few days." Daniel's heart dropped. "Lisa." She picked up her bag and turned toward the door. "Figure out who you really are, Dan," she said softly, "because right now, I don't know if I want to be married to him." And then she was gone. Olivia sat in a sleek black leather chair in the newsroom of NBC Nightly News, the bright lights of the studio casting a soft glow on her composed face. Across from her, Anderson Graves, one of the network's top anchors, studied her carefully. "You've called this a defining moment in America's struggle with systemic racism." Anderson began. "Why do you believe this case is so important?" Olivia folded her hands. "Because it's not just about me. It's about every person who's been stopped, harassed, or assaulted because of the color of their skin. I have a platform, but what about the thousands of people who don't?" Anderson nodded. "Some argue that Officer Briggs was just doing his job." "Was he?" Olivia tilted her head. "Or was he doing what he thought his job was, which?" In his mind, included treating a black woman as inherently suspicious? The anchor hesitated, then asked, "What do you want to see happen next?" Olivia's voice was strong, unwavering. "I want justice, not just for me, but for everyone who's been harmed by this system. And I promise you, I won't stop until we see real change." The camera zoomed in on her face, capturing the fire in her eyes. Daniel Briggs had no idea what was coming. But soon, he would. The city was no longer the same. What had once been just another metropolitan skyline, filled with its usual hum of business and life, had now become a stage for outrage, resistance, and reckoning. The protest started small, groups of activists holding signs in front of the police precinct, chanting demands for justice. But by the end of the week, the crowds had swelled into the thousands, spreading across multiple districts. The air was thick with righteous anger and the sharp tang of spray paint as words like, "End police brutality," "Justice for Olivia Carter," and "The badge is not a shield for racism," appeared on walls, sidewalks, and even the windows of government buildings. The tension between the protesters and law enforcement was reaching a dangerous boiling point. At first, the police presence was passive, officers standing with arms crossed, watching from behind barricades. But as the crowds grew, so did the response: riot shields, batons, and the looming threat of tear gas. At the center of it all was Olivia Carter. Though she hadn't attended the protests herself, her words and presence loomed over every moment. The people weren't just marching for her, they were marching for every victim before her and everyone who might come after. Inside the governor's office, a crisis meeting was underway. Governor Richard Gaines, a seasoned politician with a talent for walking the tightrope of controversy, sat at the head of a long mahogany table. Surrounding him were his closest advisors, representatives from the police department, and legal experts. The video of Olivia's arrest played on a loop on the projector screen behind them. "This is getting out of control," said Deputy Mayor Karen Ellis, her voice tight with frustration. "The protests are disrupting the entire city. And if we don't get ahead of this, we're going to have riots on our hands." Governor Gaines steepled his fingers. "We need to be careful about how we handle this. If we come down too hard, it'll look like we're suppressing free speech. If we do nothing, it'll look like we're weak." He turned to Commissioner Derek Langley, the head of the police department. "What's your department's plan to contain this?" Langley shifted in his seat, his jaw tight. "We've been exercising restraint, but I'll be honest with you, Governor, the officers are on edge. If this keeps escalating, we'll have to authorize the use of force." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Everyone knew what use of force meant. Gaines exhaled through his nose. "What's the status of the DOJ investigation?" A legal advisor, a short man in a gray suit, cleared his throat. "It's moving forward. The department is already under scrutiny, and they've requested documentation on multiple officers, including Briggs. If they find a pattern of racial bias, they could push for federal intervention." Langley cursed under his breath. The governor turned to his press secretary. "We need a statement. Something that acknowledges the situation without admitting wrongdoing." His press secretary nodded. "I'll draft something." Gaines sighed, rubbing his temples. "And someone get me a meeting with Carter. If we can talk to her directly, maybe we can calm things down before this city burns." Daniel sat in the dimly lit office of his attorney, Mitchell Tanner, staring blankly at the thick folder on the desk between them. Inside were pages and pages of evidence, compiled not just from Olivia Carter's case but from other complaints against him, ones he had never taken seriously before. Tanner, a sharp-eyed, silver-haired lawyer who had made a career out of defending police officers in misconduct cases, was flipping through the file with an expression of barely concealed exasperation. "You're in deep shit, Briggs," Tanner finally said, tossing the folder closed. Daniel clenched his jaw. "I was doing my job." Tanner snorted. "Your job is about to cost you everything." Daniel leaned forward, his voice low. "I didn't know who she was. If she were anyone else, this wouldn't be happening." Tanner's gaze hardened. "That's exactly the problem, Daniel. If she were anyone else, she wouldn't have had the power to fight back." Daniel sat back, stunned into silence. Tanner continued. "They're gunning for you. And not just Carter. The DOJ is looking at every move you've ever made. If they find a pattern, you won't just lose your badge, you'll be facing federal charges." Daniel swallowed. So what do we do? Tanner sighed, rubbing his chin. Right now, we fight like hell. But deep down, Daniel knew that this fight would be unlike any he'd ever faced before. Olivia Carter wasn't surprised when she received an invitation to meet with Governor Richard Gaines. She had expected it. The governor's office was a grand space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. When Olivia entered, she found Gaines, the mayor, and Commissioner Langley waiting for her. Senator Carter. Gaines greeted her with a politician's practiced smile. Thank you for coming. Olivia took a seat across from him. Let's not waste time. Governor, I assume you want to talk about the protests. Gaines nodded. The situation is escalating, and we need to find a way to de-escalate it before someone gets hurt. Olivia folded her hands on the table. Then hold Briggs accountable. Fire him. Prosecute him. Show the public that there are real consequences for officers who abuse their power. Langley shifted in his seat. We can't just throw him to the wolves. Due process has to be followed. Olivia's gaze snapped to him. Where was my due process when he shoved me against my car and handcuffed me in public? Langley had no answer. Gaines cleared his throat. Look, Senator, we're willing to make policy changes. But we need a commitment from you to help calm things down. Olivia let out a slow breath. Governor, I want reform, not just in words, but in action. If you're serious about that, then we can talk. The governor exchanged a glance with the mayor. He knew Olivia wasn't bluffing. That night, the protests exploded. A confrontation between demonstrators and police turned violent. Tear gas filled the air. Rubber bullets flew. The city became a battlefield. Olivia watched from her television, her stomach twisting. This wasn't what she wanted. And then the news broke. A protester had been shot. The victim, an unarmed black teenager, lay bleeding on the pavement. The footage spread like wildfire. The city erupted. And Olivia Carter knew. There was no going back now. This fight had just become bigger than her. The city was on fire, not in the literal sense. Not yet, but the tension was hotter than it had ever been. The shooting of Jamal Harris, a 17-year-old black teenager who had been at the protests unarmed, had turned the protests into a full-scale uprising. The police department released a brief statement. The incident is under review. The officer involved has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. It was the same line they always used. But this time, no one was buying it. The protests that had once been organized and peaceful were now chaotic. Fueled by rage, grief, and exhaustion, businesses in the downtown district boarded up their windows. And law enforcement doubled their presence, riot gear, armored vehicles, military-style formations. The streets belonged to the people. But the police treated it like a battlefield. Olivia Carter sat in her office. Her fingers curled around her phone, reading messages from activists, politicians, and citizens who were all demanding the same thing. What are you going to do now? She turned on the TV. The footage played again and again, Jamal on the ground, bleeding out, the horrified screams of protesters, the flashing red and blue lights illuminating tear-streaked faces. She felt sick. Rachel Moreno stormed into the office. Her face flushed. We had to go out there. Olivia, people are looking to you. They need a leader. Olivia closed her eyes for a moment. She had spent her whole career fighting this fight. But this wasn't about legislation anymore. This wasn't about hearings or carefully worded press releases. This was about survival. Call a press conference, she said. I need to speak to the people. Rachel hesitated. Are you sure? Olivia's hands tightened into fists. I won't sit back and watch them kill another black child. The press conference was held outside City Hall, where thousands of protesters had gathered. Olivia stood behind the podium, cameras flashing in her face, the microphone amplifying the weight of her words. She didn't start with anger. She started with pain. Jamal Harris should be alive right now, she said, her voice steady but thick with emotion. He should be with his family. He should be laughing with his friends. He should have had a future. She let the silence settle. Let the grief sink in. But instead, he is dead, and we are once again standing in the shadow of a system that sees black bodies as disposable. A murmur rippled through the crowd. They tell us to wait for an investigation. But how many times have we heard that before? How many times have we waited, only to see no justice? Applause. Shouts of agreement. Olivia lifted her chin. We will not be silenced. We will not let them sweep this under the rug. And we will not allow Jamal's death to be just another statistic." The crowd erupted. She wasn't just speaking for Jamal. She was speaking for all of them. And in that moment, she knew, this movement was now unstoppable. Daniel Briggs sat in the darkness of his living room, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table beside him. His phone had stopped ringing. Most of his friends had either abandoned him or were too afraid to be seen supporting him. The department had fully distanced itself from him. He was no longer just suspended. He was facing criminal charges. His lawyer, Mitchell Tanner, had called earlier that evening with the news he had been dreading. "The DOJ has found evidence of a pattern of misconduct," Tanner had said. "They're charging you with civil rights violations under federal law. And that's just the beginning." Daniel had laughed bitterly. "The beginning of what? The end of my life?" Tanner didn't respond right away. Then, carefully, he said, "Daniel, listen to me. They're offering a plea deal. If you cooperate, if you admit wrongdoing, testify about systemic issues within the department, you might be able to avoid prison." Daniel had hung up without answering. Now, sitting alone in his house, he turned on the TV and saw Olivia Carter's face, her speech still playing on a loop. "We will not be silenced," she had said. He hated her, but more than that, he hated what he had become. For the first time, he wondered if Lisa had been right. Maybe he had been the villain all along. The trial of Daniel Briggs began 2 months later. The courtroom was packed, journalists, activists, legal experts, and ordinary citizens who had followed the case from the beginning. Outside, a sea of protesters stood in silence, holding up pictures of Olivia Carter's arrest, of Jamal Harris, of every victim who had been wronged by the system. Inside, Daniel sat at the defendant's table, his once proud arrogance now replaced with exhaustion. Olivia Carter sat in the front row of the courtroom, watching as the system that had protected men like him for so long finally turned against him. The prosecution's case was airtight. The video evidence, the history of complaints against Daniel, testimonies from other victims who had once been ignored. And then, the moment came. The moment that shattered whatever defense Daniel had left. Lisa Briggs took the stand. She was calm, composed, but her voice carried an undeniable weight. "I've spent years convincing myself that my husband was a good man," Lisa said, her eyes scanning the courtroom. "But I can't lie to myself anymore. I saw the way he spoke about black people. I saw the way he treated them differently. And when I watched the video of what he did to Senator Carter, I realized," her voice broke, "I realized that the man I married was a racist." A gasp swept through the courtroom. Daniel's head dropped into his hands. It was over. The judge's voice rang through the room. "The jury finds the defendant guilty on all counts." Olivia closed her eyes, exhaling deeply. It wasn't just about Daniel Briggs. It was about accountability. It was about a system that had finally been forced to look at itself in the mirror. As she stepped outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in cheers. People hugged, cried, celebrated. But Olivia knew, this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The gavel struck the wooden podium, sealing Daniel Briggs' fate. The courtroom, filled with reporters, activists, and families who had waited years for justice, erupted in murmurs. Outside, the crowd roared with emotion, some in joy, some in anger, but all aware that something historic had just happened. Daniel sat frozen in his chair, staring blankly ahead. The word guilty echoed in his ears. His lawyer, Mitchell Tanner, leaned in. "You need to prepare for sentencing," he murmured. Daniel barely registered his words. His hands were clammy, his heart racing. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had never imagined himself sitting here, being judged the way he had once judged others. Across the room, Olivia Carter watched him, not with triumph, but with something else, something heavier. Disappointment? Sadness? Resolve? She wasn't sure. When the judge called for order, Daniel's throat was too dry to swallow. "Officer Briggs will be taken into custody immediately until sentencing is determined." The final blow. 2 officers, men Daniel had once worked alongside, approached him. He felt their hands grip his arms as they led him away. The same way he had once led others in handcuffs. Without remorse. The irony of it all didn't escape him. As he was escorted past Olivia, he finally met her eyes. For the first time, there was no defiance left in him. He had lost. And Olivia Carter knew, this was bigger than him. This was bigger than her. This was the moment a nation had been forced to look itself in the mirror. The courtroom may have decided Briggs' fate, but Olivia Carter knew that the battle was far from over. The system that had allowed men like him to act with impunity for years was still intact. The justice system had delivered a rare victory. But the real question remained. Would it last? Would it lead to actual change? As she walked out of the courthouse, a swarm of reporters rushed toward her. Senator Carter, do you believe this verdict sets a precedent for future cases of police misconduct? Do you think systemic reform is truly possible? What will your next move be? She held up her hand, silencing them. Then, standing before the cameras, she spoke, not just to them, but to the entire nation watching. This is not just about one officer. This is about a system that has allowed countless injustices to go unpunished. Today, we saw accountability, but justice? Justice only happens when we change the laws, the policies, and the culture that allowed this to happen in the first place. She paused, letting her words sink in. I intend to introduce legislation that will overhaul our police accountability system. Transparency, oversight, an end to the policies that allow racial bias to dictate who gets to walk away free and who gets brutalized. We cannot let this moment be just another case in history. We must turn it into a movement that leads to real change. The crowd erupted in applause. The fight had only just begun. Daniel sat on the cold metal bench in his holding cell, staring at the chipped concrete walls. He had spent his entire career believing that people like him didn't end up here. But now, he was just another prisoner. The first night in jail had been hell. The other inmates recognized him immediately. Some mocked him, others threatened him. You ruined lives. Man, how does it feel now? Where's your badge now, cop? You afraid? You should be. He barely slept, his back pressed against the wall, keeping his eyes open. When morning came, his lawyer visited him. You'll be sentenced next month, Tanner said, placing a file on the table. Depending on how the judge rules, you're looking at anywhere from 10 to 20 years behind bars. Daniel felt his stomach drop. You can get me out sooner, right? Tanner sighed. The best I can do is argue for leniency. But public pressure is huge. The judge won't go easy on you. Daniel's fingers clenched into fists. You could help yourself, Tanner added carefully. Testify. Expose the corruption within the department. If you cooperate, it might reduce your sentence. Daniel's jaw tightened. You want me to betray the people I worked with? They betrayed you first, Tanner said bluntly. They dropped you the second this case went public. If you want to rot in prison for their sins, be my guest. But you might be the only one who can expose how deep this really goes. For the first time, Daniel Briggs had to decide. Would he go down alone? Or would he finally tell the truth? Months passed. The protests had evolved into something bigger, a movement that led to new bills being proposed, new policies being debated. Olivia Carter had become the face of reform, working tirelessly to ensure that what happened to her, to Jamal Harris, and to so many others, would never happen again. The bill she proposed, the Police Accountability and Reform Act, was being discussed in Congress. It wasn't perfect. There was opposition, but the tide had shifted. People were no longer willing to accept silence. One evening, as Olivia sat in her office, her phone rang. It was her assistant. Senator, I think you should see the latest statement from Daniel Briggs. Olivia frowned, opening her laptop. What she saw stunned her. Briggs had agreed to testify before Congress. In a lengthy statement, he had admitted to the racial bias within the force, the unspoken rules that allowed officers to target black citizens more harshly, the cover-ups, the lies, the abuse of power. It was a confession that would shake law enforcement to its core. For the first time, he had told the truth. Olivia leaned back in her chair, exhaling. Change was coming. It would not be easy. It would take years of fighting, pushing, demanding more. But for the first time in a long time, she believed that it was possible. Outside her window, the city lights twinkled, and Olivia Carter knew that the battle was far from over. But this time, they weren't fighting alone.